Hi, my name is Elizabeth McPherson, and this is my case study for 855. So, the overview of this study is this case takes place at Rocket Junior High School. Richard Inman is a first year assistant principal who's worked hard to build relationships with students from the most difficult areas of town. After being tipped off to a questionable exchange in the hallway between the ringleader of the toughest kids and an honor roll student without a single smudge on his record, and then the discovery of a school prohibited weapon, Richard must make a decision on how to proceed with the disciplinary actions against both students based on both policy and ethics. So, looking a little bit further into the situation. So, this is taking place at Rocket Junior High School. So they're pretty vague about the district. So there's really not any information about other schools, other principals there might be. It kind of tells us that there's roughly 900 students, but it doesn't really give us any more information than that. Is this the only junior high school? Are there five other ones? Kind of that kind of thing. Where I think that plays in is, you know, obviously district policy is district policy, but are there five middle schools trying to adhere to the same policies? Is there just one middle school where policy reform might be a little bit easier? Things like that. I think that there is a definite indication of a socioeconomic divide in the community. So it alludes to South Side kids as this rougher group of students, kind of separates them. So kind of are tipped off to know that this town isn't kind of harmonious, so to speak, in terms of the range of experiences and opportunities that these students have. And then it does look like the district has an alternative placement program. So not all schools have that. It's a good resource in general, but it kind of gives you a little bit of indication that this district has a need for it and that there's probably students who are going there quite frequently. So Principal Inman has worked to build relationships within the school. So it noted that he had set a goal to reach these tough kids. He himself was from some of the tougher neighborhoods and really kind of wanted to be a person that helped turn around this reputation. And overall, it seemed that in the year that he'd been working, um, he was able to do that. So he had kind of reached out to the leader of this South Side group of kids. The student's name was James. As a result of kind of connecting with James, spending time after school with him, etc., they had seen an improvement in grades in this um, Southside group of students. They had seen students mixing more of the kids from different areas of the community and different socioeconomic statuses mixing, and they did notice a decrease in fights, especially from James. James seems to have some behavior issues in the past that maybe were starting to get ironed out a little bit with this new principal relationship. So there is an issue that arises. So James does have this track record of kind of poor behavior. So a teacher calls his office and reports that they're going to send James down to the office because he was tardy to class. So as soon as James gets out of the classroom, the teacher witnesses him giving another student something in the hallway. So the teacher is a little bit concerned that this could be a drug exchange, especially with the background that James has. So she calls the principal, lets him know, hey, this is what I saw in the hallway, and here's who I saw it happen with. So the exchange happened with a student named David Romas. He's an honor roll student in the band, no behavior concerns, but the teacher does note that he kind of had a very nervous demeanor in the interaction that she saw. So James is on his way to the principal's office. This teacher kind of recalls and says, hey, not only was he tardy, but I just saw him give something to this kid in the hallway, and I'm nervous about what it might have been. So the principal decides to confront the conflict. So he had spent significant time building relationships with James, but he really didn't have a relationship at all with this David kid. He could really not recall anything more than one interaction with David after a band concert. So what he decides to do is not only have James come to his office, but have David come to his office as well. And he does request that the school police officer join the meeting. So when they all get there, the principal asked what happened in the hallway. James just said he gave something to David. David begins to get very nervous, very scared, starts to cry, and refuses to say anything to the principal. He's just choosing not to respond at all. So In light of this, David was searched by the police officer and they found a pair of brass knuckles on him. This is a prohibited weapon in the school and it did constitute a felony offense. So David's handcuffed, he's going to get taken by the police. All of a sudden, James stands up and says, "You know what? I gave those to David. I threatened him. I told him I'd beat him up if he didn't carry them for me." So there are some policies in place at the school that mandate action as a result of finding the brass knuckles and with the confession that James brought them to school. So um, they have to remain handcuffed and they're going to both be taken to jail. James is going to be taken to jail also, and they're going to be charged with felony possession charges. The board policy does require expulsion for no less than 45 days when this type of incident happens. So here we kind of reach the dilemma. So these boys have been called into the office. These brass knuckles have been found on David. James admits to having them and giving them to David through threatening action. And the police is saying, I got to take them both. I got to charge them both with this felony, and I'm arresting them both, and they're both going to have to be expelled to the alternative school for at least 45 days. So Principal Inman has this ethical dilemma with the policies that are in place, and he's feeling pretty upset with what kind of he's expected to follow through. So he kind of first notes that he regrets maybe having the police in the meeting with the student. Doesn't say that directly, but it says kind of in quotations or in parentheses that he regrets the decision to call the police. So the principal ends up kind of having this sense of pride for James. James has a history of behavior, kind of history of maybe probably lying, cheating, stealing, I would assume. And so I think the principal has some pride that James was willing to stand up and tell the truth, let them know that it was his fault, not David's fault. So he's feeling upset that David's going to have to suffer a really severe consequence, like 45 days of expulsion, just simply maybe for the peer pressure of the bully. And he does kind of think that David is an innocent victim in the situation. So because of that, this interferes with this policy where he is required to expel them both for 45 days. So he does end up calling both sets of parents. James's mom is kind of used to her son being in trouble. She kind of states, he's going to learn a lesson, leave him there, good luck. I'll come get him in a couple days. Maybe he needs the alternative school again. Dean's mother, on the other hand, is immediately at the school. She's very upset. She's feeling very frustrated that he's going to get punished for something he didn't do. So the principal Inman does the following. He completes the expulsion paperwork for James, but he refuses to write the paperwork for David. He understands that this is a violation of policy, but he does believe that it is an ethical mistake of his if he files that paperwork to expel David. So we're kind of left at this crossroads where he's filed this paperwork for James but refuses to file it for David. So here's some of the legal issues that we see. Students obviously have an illegal weapon at school. This is a legal issue to have a weapon at school. We know that both students at one point had possession of the weapon. David has admitted to having the item on him. They find it, and then James confesses to bringing it to school. So there are felony charges being filed. Obviously, the legal obligation that the police have to file these reports, and the school policy kind of exists that they both have to be expelled. So then you kind of have the legal piece of this teacher being a mandated reporter. So obviously, teachers, when we see things that we're concerned about, that could be a safety concern to students, we are kind of legally obligated to make these reports when we're concerned. So ethically, we have this belief that David was intimidated or threatened, and not only belief, but the statement on James's behalf that he did bully David into taking the weapon. We have what the principal kind of believes to be unethical school policies about this zero tolerance. There's obviously a violation of policy by not filing the expulsion paperwork. There is a sense of pride in making the right decision and kind of a sense of having some sense of accountability to David to have to kind of acknowledge his innocence in the situation. So it's definitely kind of a tug and war between the two here. So overall, here's my synthesis. Principal Inman has decided to break school policy and not expel David, a student who was threatened to carry an unauthorized weapon on school property for James, on ethical and moral grounds that he believed David was bullied into the situation, while still expelling James for bringing the weapon to school. So here are the people that are involved. Obviously, the principal is involved. It's his first year as the assistant principal. He seems to know the community well, growing up in the community, but it's really his first role in this, or first year in this role. James is kind of a rough crowd kid. He has a big kind of rap sheet in terms of behavior. He's been to the alternative school before. Mom kind of has this like teach him a lesson mentality. Just kind of a kid who really needs to be kind of rallied and given support a little bit. We have the student David who gets handed the weapon. We know he's an honor roll student. He's kind of a lead kid in the band. He has no history of behavior, has a bright future ahead of him. Kind of lots of good credit in the school, so to speak. We have this teacher who's reporting the incident. So not only is the teacher calling to report the tardy, but then calls back to report the suspicious hallway activity. So this is kind of where it all starts. We have the police officer that's asked to join the meeting with the students and does end up arresting and charging the students. We have the parents that are notified, James's parent, who has kind of a different reaction than David's mom. And then we have the community involvement. There is obviously a huge socioeconomic divide being experienced, and we kind of have maybe that breakdown in the community outside of the school. So in terms of the place in the program, this takes place at Rocket Junior High. Again, we're not really given anything super clear beyond that. We know that the incident happened in the classroom and in the hallway. So James was tardy, he gets sent to the office, therefore he's in the hallway, ends up passing this item to another student, which results in all of them kind of being in the office. So that kind of culminates to this big meeting in the office with the students, the principal, and the police. So in terms of the programming, again, there's really not a lot of information given. I don't know what kind of behavior policies they have in place besides the zero tolerance. But in terms of, I'm a big restorative kind of practices person. So in terms of just some of the alternatives to what's happening, what they have in place. And then obviously they do tell us about the zero tolerance policy, that any of this kind of weapons or felony charge kind of stuff does result in 45 days of expulsion. But we're really given no more clear information on exact language, maybe, or, prior situations that have happened with the zero tolerance policy. So I do think there's some pretty significant potential for damage with relationships. Obviously, there's going to be some disagreement in decision making. Principal Inman's making one decision, but not everyone's going to agree with him. He's new to this position, which could cause, some damage with the relationships he's tried to build since he's so new. And I think there's definitely a huge potential for distrust that administration will or will not follow policy. So kind of whatever happens from here, that it builds on, can people count on them to do what they're supposed to do? And there are quite a few people who have a stake in what happens next. So obviously the administration, how does this affect what they have to do in the future for kids in the future? It affects the staff. Again, can we count on our administration to follow through when we need them to? And it obviously very much affects the students and the families. They want to be able to trust the policy, but they also want their student to be given kind of the benefit of the doubt, a fair chance at kind of restoration and honesty and maybe investigation of the situation. So I think there's a couple questions that I would still ask in this situation. So first of all, like, why didn't the teacher that called this all in maybe have to come down for more information? What other admin was a part of this? So I guess in my view, if I'm an assistant principal and this kind of level of incident arises, like, I'm probably going to go get my principal. I'm probably going to ask for some backup, kind of go one step above myself and ask for that support. So curious, like, where the principal is in this situation. I'm curious if there's cameras. So what else can they know about the situation, and what else did they try to know about the situation? It seems like there really wasn't a lot else done to try to kind of look into the situation. What communication was given to families about the zero tolerance policy? It indicates that David's mom knows nothing about it. And then what legal protections cover David outside of school? So obviously, it happened in school, but he's getting arrested in a charge is being filed in kind of this kind of civilian legal world, so to speak. So, what is he entitled to in terms of kind of a fair shake at investigating the situation? And then what requirements are there for students being arrested at school? So I work in a self-contained setting in my school right now, and we have some pretty clear kind of guidelines in terms of when a student can be arrested. And I'm wondering if simply the presence of the police trumped anything the school wanted to do. So in my setting, there's some there's some really strict guidelines on when the police can actually arrest. Um, I'm not sure that this situation would have qualified for that. So I just am curious what kind of school policy is in terms of students being handcuffed and arrested at school is. So I see three options. Option one is for the principal to actually go back and end up expelling both students. So he realizes he has to follow the policy and he files the paperwork for David. Nothing more is really done. That's that. They both get expelled. They do their 45 days. So pros of this is obviously it follows policy. It's maybe a fair and equitable treatment based on the policy alone. And then the situation's kind of done. Consequences are delivered, they're kind of paying out their restitution, and we potentially move on. The cons of this is it does compromise the ethical stance of the principal. Obviously, the principal is not in agreement with this option. It does not give David any of that benefit of the doubt, kind of looking into it, seeing what happened. It doesn't take into account maybe that change of heart in James to honor his in honesty and integrity in the situation, and it really appears that they're really not doing anything other than that one little meeting to find out what happened. Option two would be to just kind of continue as it is. File the paperwork for James, refuse to file the paperwork for David, probably follows with an official reprimand in the principal's file, and it does ultimately end up in a violation of the policy. So the pros is it would probably shine a light on the inequity of the policy it kind of brings to light that there are probably some concerns that need to be addressed in some of the school policies. It does prevent David from going to the alternative school theoretically if someone else doesn't step in, in light of David or in light of the principal. It probably keeps parent relationships intact. David's mom probably is far more inclined to appreciate this option. James's mom seems like she doesn't really care either way. So kind of restores that relationship with David's mom. And James, ultimately does have the consequence. Someone brought a weapon to school, and so there is a consequence being administered. I think the cons of this is, again, the principal's still feeling poorly about these ethical decisions that are being made. Even though he stands up for David, he still doesn't mean he feels good about having to break the school policy. The policy is also not necessarily fixed or addressed at this point. Like he's just refusing to follow it. It's not getting fixed, or the problem isn't being addressed. There's definitely probably some trust issues within staff if administration isn't doing what the policy states. And then I definitely think it leaves ground for parents in the future to demand that their child not be punished under the zero tolerance policy. So, someone down the line says, well, David didn't get expelled, so my kid's not either. And that kind of leaves some sticky ground and maybe some favoritism kind of stuff when that happens. And then option three, I would see is maybe an investigation into the situation. The principal still kind of refuses to file the paperwork, maybe for both of the students also, until it can be looked into, get extra people involved. The policy has some time to be reviewed and interpreted, and maybe some restorative practices can be put into place. It's pretty vague on whether that's an option with the zero tolerance policy, but it could potentially maybe leave room for some alternate options. So the approach to this, I think, is it definitely establishes leadership through compromise. The principal is not saying that he won't follow through with policy. He's saying that he wants more information before he does. It encourages compromise in future decisions. It definitely looks at the whole child. So not just what's happening right now, but who are these kids in general. For David, we have this great track record, and for James, we've seen a really significant growth over the years. So you're kind of looking at all of that background. It honors parents' concerns, honors the students, and it definitely involves more people than just who was in that small little room. I think the cons are obviously this is going to take time. It's going to be an extra thing on these people's plates. think there's the high possibility for pushback. People are going to say, this is the policy, you need to follow it, it doesn't matter, we're not looking into this. And then again, at the end of the day, it's still a violation of the policy if they're not expelling these students. So, there might be some of that middle ground to look into it, but it's still, at the end of the day, might be seen as a violation to policy. There's probably people who want these kids expelled immediately. So I believe that the investigation policy is the best option. So the principal does have an obligation to do something. I personally do not believe his obligation is to file that paperwork immediately, but he does have an obligation to address the situation immediately. So involving other administration allows him to reach out for the support and collaboration to not do it alone. And obviously a weapon can't be ignored. He can't just pretend there wasn't a weapon on school property. By conducting the investigation, I think it allows for facts to be gathered, so we're not kind of relying on these two kids' stories or just kind of one police officer who says this is how it has to be. And then I think it shows the students and the staff that there can be ethical and legal processes put into place at once. So the principal can kind of fall into his ethical guidelines of worrying about suspending or expelling David, but also follow the legal process for there being a weapon at school. I then think it kind of sheds light on this zero tolerance policy. So I do agree that it needs to be evaluated, and by investigating the situation, whether or not they both get expelled, one of them does, the outcome doesn't necessarily matter, but it at least gives some integrity to sitting down and looking at the policy and the situation a little bit more closely. And then obviously there is an ethical responsibility that allows the principal to feel like he's kind of explored all the options. So I would say step one is to call for immediate review and fact gathering. So, that's fine. Keep the kids in the office, maybe even bring the kids to the police station, whatever, but we're going to call that teacher in. We're going to get more information from the teacher. We're going to try to figure out what other kids were in the hallway and talk to those kids. We're going to look at any video footage that we can, like what was the demeanor of the students? Was David being bullied? Was he willing? Was he waiting in the hall? Did David or did James track him down? What actually happened? And then I think giving the students the opportunity to talk privately. David was obviously very intimidated and scared in that meeting, probably by James, by the principal, by the police officer. This poor kid has probably never been in the principal's office before in his life. So kind of taking such punitive action without giving him the chance to be in a setting that's safe for him to kind of share the honest truth about the situation, I think is not fair. So then I would get the complete information and meet with my team. Again, I would definitely find a principal, a district staff, someone else to be a part of this with me and help make this decision. Review that zero tolerance policy. So I think one of the things I kept thinking this whole time is don't necessarily look for a loophole. Don't try to get around it, but don't accept this blanket punishment that no matter what, you're expelled. What does the language really say? How does David fit into that? How does James fit into that? And be honest to that kind of time to look into it. Again, not to get around it, but to really honestly, genuinely make sure you're following it accurately. And then does it allow for any alternatives? Can we do some restorative practice? Is there any other option other than just the expelling and the alternative school? And then I also think by gathering as a team and making those decisions and looking at that policy, it's really protecting your staff. There can be some internal and or external issues that might come from a single person making a decision. And so when you can kind of say our school team or our school staff made this decision, it does protect those individuals. I then think there does need to be appropriate consequence. At the end of the day, a weapon was at school. At the end of the day, it did get handed from hand to hand. And so I do think that any appropriate legal consequences have to be administered. I'm not about getting kids out of consequences, but I'm about the just administering of those consequences. And then put them in the alternative school if that's really what the policies state after you kind of all the facts are ironed out. And then I think the most important step to this process is look to make those changes, look to make situations like this less murky in the future. So look at changing the zero tolerance policy where needed, clarify some things, loosen some restrictions, really make sure it's exactly how you as a school and a staff ethically feel like situations like this should be dealt for. discuss what's going to happen the next time, whether the policy changes or not, what's going to happen next time, and then train your staff to handle that situation. My first question, I think, also went to like, why'd the teacher kick that out? Like, I really get frustrated when teachers make tardy kids leave. Like, you wanted them in your class on time, and they're late, so you're just asking them not to be there at all. Like, maybe talk about some opportunities for like, why are we letting our kids in the hallway? Like, how could we have prevented, obviously not him bringing the weapon to school, but maybe the handoff, and prevented David getting involved at all. And then obviously be maybe more aware of how we're notifying parents of the policies that exist. So outcome one is that this works, right? Everyone cooperates, the situation is looked at objectively, appropriate follow-up happens, maybe suspensions, maybe not, but everyone kind of is happy with how it goes once all the information is gathered. Outcome two would be that there's there's maybe mostly participation, but there's maybe some pushback. Maybe parents don't really like what's happening. Maybe there's not really anything more to be gathered. Maybe there aren't cameras. Maybe there aren't students. Maybe this teacher's like, I don't know, I told you all I told you. So there's really, maybe they just kind of spin their wheels when they try to gather information. And then again, maybe nothing really more is known. So outcome three would be that it's just done poorly. So maybe they try to gather this information, but they don't really try very hard. They're not really getting the information they need, and or maybe they have a bias. So maybe the people collecting the information kind of already either have a bias towards David or a bias towards James, and or a bias towards or against the school, and it might not shake out as fair as we want it to. And then obviously the last option is maybe the school, school board, the district, whatever, kind of says no. This is what happened. We found them with this weapon. They get arrested, they go, end of story. There's really not room for compromise. So maybe the people above the principal kind of say, nope, we're not doing this. You have to expel both boys. Done and done. So then obviously if the principal doesn't follow that, he's given that letter of reprimand. So should any of that happen, I would think that the plan B or the next option would be to follow policy this time, but bring more attention to the moral and ethical concerns that you're having with the school. So obviously, if you hit kind of these dead ends, you maybe need to comply with policy for now, and then bring light to your issues after the fact. The other option would be for the principal to continue refusing, and it could potentially result in losing his job. So here's the standard that this case study went off of. Again, I think these are really good things to consider. They're not unlikely to happen, and so it's a good place to look where we can be successful leaders and make these ethical decisions for our students and for ourselves. Thank you so much, and I enjoyed the course.